It's okay.
Au nom du président de la République et en vertu des pouvoirs qui nous sont conférés, nous vous faisons chevaliers de la Légion d'honneur.
Monsieur l'ambassadeur, dear François, Mademoiselle le secrétaire général honoraire, dear Mademoiselle Marchand, Françoise, Philippe, and everyone, it's amazing to have you here today. It's more amazing than I could imagine when I was ready. To borrow from a famous headline in Le Monde, nous sommes tous Français aujourd'hui. Mademoiselle Marchand has painted a very rosy portrait. However, reflecting on the rationale behind this award, I have thought that France probably did not have a full picture when the decision to give it was made. So in no particular order, I'd like to disclose a few examples of things that most certainly were not taken under consideration. Number one, I have smuggled many times, including meats and cheeses. Such things as a Poisse cheese. You've probably smelled it in my luggage. Number two, 15 years ago, I trespassed into the home of Marguerite Yourcenar, a favorite French author and the first woman elected to the Académie Française. The trespassing was the result of my enthusiasm when I located her cottage with a friend one snowy day in Maine. I believe there was an encounter with a policeman, but I'm not saying for sure. Number three, also certainly not considered, is the fact that at the age of 4 or 5, I, like many children, had an imaginary friend. However, my particular imaginary friend was Mrs. Mellinger, also known as Madame Mélanger, an imaginary French teacher. I conversed with her unintelligibly for hundreds of hours. And finally, certainly not under consideration for this award, was my sense of style, or lack thereof. Style is something we Americans find indissociable from the image of France and French women. As proof, I present a newsletter column I illustrated in 2nd grade at Murch Elementary School. Butchering the French language, I keenly entitled my column, The Feminique Boutique, and then proceeded to sketch 3 or 4 horrid ensembles. I think we can all agree that none of this portended well. So how did we get here tonight? Well, thank goodness my parents persevered despite several of these examples. During my adolescence, they thrusted France in my path on several occasions, presumably with the hope that some culture might stick. My mother, Marie, had a fondness for both the language and the country, and she inspired an awe in me for the Cro-Magnon sites in southwestern France. This interest would eventually and literally draw me deep into France as I studied archaeology. In addition to my parents and all the opportunities they harnessed to bring France to me, there is someone who truly, truly prepared the terrain, and I'm so thankful she is here tonight so that I may recognize her. Madame Denise France, my NCS French teacher for 4 years, terrified me. She is the sort of instructor who enters the room and everyone snaps to attention. She has a high standard typical of professors in France, and I remember the searing paralysis that set in when she called on me to speak, which I did very poorly. But I admired her very much and sought to please her. College French afterwards was a cakewalk, and arriving in Paris for my junior year, I benefited immediately from the foundation she laid, accessing it like a perfect hard drive. Without Madame France, I honestly don't believe I would have a technical command of the language. Mademoiselle Marchand has also been a huge influence in general, but specifically in terms of language. In addition to idolizing her savoir-faire, admiring her perfect knowledge of protocol, and observing her work selflessly to promote a cause she loved deeply, and infecting me with that love, I think I osmosed her respect for the formal rules of language, although I still make mistakes and she still corrects me every time. So I owe these two women the world, because the language was the reason working at the Pasteur Foundation and for the Institut Pasteur was possible. That and 1,000 hours of subtitled movies carefully watched. French cinema, and especially Eric Romer, have been very, very good to me. When I started working for the Institut Pasteur, nearly 120,000 U.S. cases of AIDS had been reported. In 8 short years since its appearance, the plague of my generation, HIV, had already taken 90,000 American lives. The import of infectious disease research couldn't have had more resonance for me, and ever since it has shaped my thinking. Working for a scientific organization that happened to be French, therefore, was the best of all possible worlds. During my Pasteur years, there were 2 periods when I felt more French in spirit than American. And Françoise, I'm so happy you're here for this. The first relates to an ugly chapter in U.S. public health, when our country quite literally stole the intellectual property and thereby the financial resources of the Institut Pasteur. The matter relates to the AIDS blood test. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the conflict. And for half a decade, I watched my country wage a sort of commercial war on Pasteur and as a consequence on France. And I was not proud. Thanks to Mademoiselle Marchand, her Pasteur colleagues, and a generation of French diplomats and politicians, things were eventually made right, and David finally defeated Goliath, and Pasteur would go on, and specifically Françoise Barré-Sinoussi would go on, to receive the Nobel Prize for that work. But it was too long a time in the coming. In the interim, the price was tension between the U.S. and Pasteur, and a former secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, Stuart Simonson, who's here, I saw him a minute ago. It was in part Stuart's vision which helped to repair the relationship between Pasteur and HHS and to transform it into an effective Franco-American collaboration on global surveillance of influenza. The second significant bond I felt with France, America's first ally, followed 9/11. It still moves me to think of how the phone rang with calls of concern. The first one came from Mademoiselle Marchand and was followed by many others. How many messages of solidarity I received. And I shared our allies' disbelief when America moved towards war. And I saw France's anti-Iraq war stance as the best kind of tough love a good friend could hope to receive. Unfortunately, the United States would be unpersuaded, and it led to an unforgettable low point in Franco-American relations. But France reacted strategically. In February 2003, the ambassador, Jean-David Lévy, rang me. In fact, Ambassador Lévy personally called every single French association in the United States to say that the work to repair the relationship could now be done only at our level. It was inspiring to be called to service in this way, and I think of the Pasteur programs, specifically our postdoctoral fellowship program for U.S. scientists, as fulfilling this mission. And that was the vision of Philippe Kurelski, one of many innovations that he introduced, for which I thank him and recognize him. Those programs were the fruit of a spirited team fundraising work for which people like Marian John Young of the Gould Foundation, Elizabeth Fondaris, a dear, dear friend and mentor, and Agnès Yvon, a cherished member of the Pasteur Foundation board, deserve more credit than I. So you see that France takes its relationship with the U.S. very seriously, and I admire the tireless efforts of Ambassador Delattre, particularly with his work on Capitol Hill with the French caucus, to solder together American and French interests. In all of this, I think the point that I'm laboring toward is that if it were not for the perspective my affinity for France has afforded me, I doubt that I would have come to certain revelations about my country and myself. And I am reminded of something Marguerite Yourcenar wrote in her magnificent novel, Memoirs of Hadrian. I'd like to quote it first in French because it is much prettier. Le véritable lieu de naissance est celui où l'on a porté pour la première fois un coup d'œil intelligent sur soi-même, which in English is the true birthplace is the one wherein for the first time one looks intelligently upon oneself. And by this definition, France would be my true birthplace. In addition to Mademoiselle Marchand, there's a unique influential person from my time at Pasteur whom I've mentioned, Elizabeth von Daris. And I'll conclude with the sentiment she expressed when she received the Legion of Honor. France has done far more for me than I for France. With that, I would like to thank my decades-long mentor and cherished friend, Marie-Hélène Marchand, who I've always called Mademoiselle as if it was her first name. And I probably will always still. And France's remarkable, unmatched representative, Ambassador Delage, whom we are very, very fortunate to have representing France. I will try very hard to live up to this honor. In fact, I'll start right now by asking Cammie, Spencer, Claire, Hawk, and maybe even the Nyblum girls, Anna, Sophia, and Bess, to study French. Learn it well. And then go forward and spend some time abroad trying it out on everyone you meet. You won't regret it, I promise. And one last remark. For more than 20 years, my father has borne the responsibility of parenthood alone. And I'd like to say simply to him that any pride he might feel today is eclipsed by my admiration and gratitude to both my mother and to him. I hope that he can bear the double weight of all I owe them both. Thank you.